Imagine if there were a place you could go to get away from all the political drama of modern life. A world without the tedium of bureaucracies and suffocating government policy. A place where anyone could do anything. Imagine a world without censorship. Nobody telling you what to do, free from the oppressive morality of the uptight, straight-laced world you live in now. Imagine if there were some haven for the world's best and brightest artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, to all gather together in pursuit of their greatest ambitions. Groundbreaking genetic research, bold business ventures, unbridled self-expression. Imagine a place so advanced and prosperous, the department stores literally sell superpowers. Seems pretty good, right? A pretty ideal place to live? Maybe a little bit too ideal? By now you're probably wondering, what's the catch? I mean, isn't that what we should expect? Doesn't every utopia come with some secret, terrible fine print? If you hadn't already sussed it out, the city I've been asking you to imagine is actually Rapture from the game BioShock. You may be familiar with it. If you are, you may also know how well that went for them. A powerful businessman builds an empire off smuggled goods, eventually leading to a brutal class war. A plastic surgeon sculpts patients to his twisted idea of beauty against their will. A geneticist conducts cruel experiments on trafficked orphans. The product, a highly addictive substance called Adam, is sold to the masses. That's how they get those superpowers I mentioned, which inevitably turns them all into horrific, gibbering mutants. Turns out, a city where literally anyone could do literally anything wasn't such a good idea after all. Kind of just the outcome you expect. This is what happens to utopias. But I have to wonder why. It almost seems like humans don't believe that there can be a perfect society without some kind of horrific trade-off. I mean, you frame it that way in so much of your fiction, I have to think that it's more than just skepticism. I don't think what I'm seeing here is just some vague uncertainty as to whether or not a utopia is possible. I think you're afraid of the very idea. Stories like Brave New World, 1984, and Harrison Bergeron are typically called dystopian. That makes sense. I don't think anyone would want to live in those worlds. But it's not really the whole picture. Literary scholars actually have a word for this type of setting, something a little more precise than dystopia. They call these anti-utopias. In a typical anti-utopian story, the horrors don't actually come from dysfunction or collapse. They come from the society acting exactly as intended. They work. These societies function. People still end up scared, miserable, paranoid. Sometimes even their leaders do, despite the all-too-successful implementation of their ideal. Like traditional utopias, these settings present functional societies that center around a specific set of beliefs, which is itself the problem. The core is rotten. A functional but undesirable society. Now, think of a more traditional dystopia. Blade Runner, V for Vendetta, Back to the Future 2. These are not what you would call functional societies. They're in disarray and falling apart. This is where Rapture is at by the time BioShock takes place, but in its golden age, it worked. At least long enough for there to be all this history for the player to see. It was, for a time, more of an anti-utopia. The consequences of its philosophy were apparent even as it was flourishing. Like many anti-utopias, it was built on an ideal that went too far. This is Stepford, from the book The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin. It's an idyllic little suburban town. There are no domestic disputes, no family squabbles, no questions about who is meant to fill what role in the home. It really is the perfect suburban dream. It works, you see, because the men of Stepford have found a way to solve the problem of matrimony. Rather than bickering with their wives, they've elected, simply, to murder them all and replace them with robots. This is the world state from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It's a far future globalist super society. Here, happiness has been maximized. Everyone is genetically engineered to fill their correct place in society. Sexual promiscuity is actually encouraged. Disease and suffering are things of the past. If you ever happen to have a bad feeling, they have a drug for that. Soma, a government-administered happiness drug. Spending is better than mending, they're conditioned to believe. A gram is better than a dam. This is America in the year 2081, as imagined in Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron. The problem of inequality has at last been solved. Handicapper generals see to it that nobody is beneath average by preventing anyone from ever being above average. They load state-sponsored handicaps onto anyone who seems to be in any way exceptional. Are we seeing a pattern here? The problems these different settings produce vary wildly, but one thing remains the same: ideology. A single solution applied recklessly across the spectrum of society. In anti-utopias, ideology tends to be presented as a hammer that fixes problems. Don't want to argue with your wife? Replace her with a robot. Don't want suffering? Take a Soma holiday instead. Don't want inequality? Bring everyone down to the same level. These solutions don't require introspection or nuance. They don't force anyone to interrogate their beliefs. They don't allow for alternative ways of problem solving, even when they present themselves. The societies in these stories use their ideologies to address any issue they encounter without questioning things too deeply, including the runaway problems of the ideologies themselves. Think of Rapture. If its founder, Andrew Ryan, had paid any mind to the rampant abuse his ideology permitted, perhaps he could have saved his city from its collapse. Maybe Stepford could have actually been an idyllic suburban town if the men attempted to understand their wives instead of resorting to murder. All of the problems in Harrison Bergeron could have been avoided if equality wasn't used as a poor substitute for equity. Brave New World in particular offers a very compelling perspective on this. All of the characters in the story have been conditioned to rely on temporary fixes to complicated issues. They indulge in orgies, consumerism, drown themselves in soma, all except for one. John is our stranger in a strange land, our fish out of water. He didn't grow up in the world state. He grew up on a Native American reservation in New Mexico. As an outsider in both cultures, he's led an isolated, troubled life. His asceticism is only made worse by his severe devotion to Christianity and his obsession with William Shakespeare. When he arrives in the world state, where these things simply do not exist, the culture shock hits hard. Toward the end of the book, John has a conversation with Mustafa Mond, the head of the world state. Far from the vapid self-indulgence of nearly everyone else John encounters, Mond is actually very well read. He's familiar with the literature and religion that John's built his life around. In fact, it's part of his job to be familiar with these things, so he knows what to withhold from the public. To Mond, art and culture, quote, aren't compatible with machinery, medicine, and happiness. They're too complex, too troubled. In the world state, even the mere mention of suffering is taboo. It simply isn't done. John is, therefore, quite the spectacle. He's treated as a curiosity in the world state due to his outsider status and his belief in strange, outdated things like grief and love. To his absolute horror, he's found himself immersed in a culture of complacency, apathy, and numbness. So when he finally meets Mond, and Mond tries to explain the necessity of removing things like religion and art from society, John snaps. Quoting Hamlet's famous monologue, he accuses Mond of removing people's right to oppose the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. He says, rather than allowing people to endure or overcome hardships, Mond has gone for a third option, one that's far too easy. Mond has opted simply to abolish suffering altogether. Don't misunderstand me. I get the appeal of Mond's ideal. I do. I know he doesn't enforce these policies because he's pure evil. He enforces them because he believes they're the best way to solve everyone's problems. Of course, a path to total uncompromised happiness is appealing, in theory. What he fails to address, though, is the desires of individual people. John, for instance, doesn't want the slings and arrows abolished. He wants the entire human experience, even the things most people would rather live without. Rejecting uninterrupted bliss and indulgence, he claims the right to be unhappy, along with the right to disease and pain and starvation. I don't want comfort, he says. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. John is asking for a lot, more than most people are probably willing to accept. In his monologue, he even tries to claim the right to syphilis and cancer. At its core, though, I think what he's saying is pretty relatable. Even the citizens of the world state feel this, although they don't completely realize it. Many of them are actually miserable. They've just been taught to suppress it with drugs, orgies, and the worship of Henry Ford. A sort of helpful surrogate for happiness, I guess. Fulfillment, however, is nowhere in sight. And this, I think, is also the basic conceit of most anti-utopias. They seem to argue that, despite the appeal, most people don't really want a life completely free of unhappiness. There's a scene that really stands out to me in The Stepford Wives. Joanna, the main character, has recently moved to Stepford with her family. She invites some of her friends to a dinner party, the ones who aren't robots, of course. It's a disaster. Her friends are having allergic reactions to the food and getting sick. They get into arguments. One of them flirts with someone else's husband and demands everyone listen to her astrology readings. This is not an experience Joanna wants to have again. Her friends are opinionated, socially awkward, self-absorbed. They're human, and that makes them exhausting. Maybe it would be easier to do away with all this stuff, the uncomfortable conversations and the minefield of social etiquette. We know in Stepford there is a way to do that. She could, like Mond, abolish her slings and arrows rather than deal with them. But this is why Joanna is the protagonist. This is what's special about her perspective. She, like John, would sooner live with every mundane, untidy, annoying suburban episode than see her friends turned into robots. Earlier I mentioned that humans seem to have a certain difficulty imagining what utopia looks like without some sort of catch. I think that's because you can't imagine a life without humanity. The people in the world state are free of suffering, but only because they're conditioned to be. In BioShock, most of the citizens become literal monsters thanks to the unlimited ambitions of Rapture's best and brightest. The women of Stepford are replaced with actual objects. You don't need my help to read that metaphor. In every case, the humanity of the individual is sacrificed for someone else's dream of utopia. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. Despite the name, I don't think anti-utopia stories are actually anti-utopian. There are so many different kinds of utopia story with so many different perspectives on the matter. They form a dialogue with each other. They're in conversation, argumentation, conflict. Many are written as a reaction to other authors' visions of the future. N.K. Jemisin's The Ones Who Stay and Fight is a response to Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano is a response to both Brave New World and We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. The whole genre is made up of ideological critiques, conflicting visions, different views of what a better world would mean. It's sort of like one big debate spanning across cultures, time periods, and mediums. But the perspective of the archetypal anti-utopia doesn't really seem to be about utopia at all. It seems to be about ideology. Rapture, for instance, isn't a direct critique of objectivism as a utopian ideal, although that is Andrew Ryan's philosophy and Rapture is built on the concept of self-interest above all else. It's not that narrow. According to the game's writer and director, Ken Levin, BioShock is, quote, not an attack on objectivism. It's a fair look at humanity. It could have been objectivism, it could have been anything. I think that makes a lot of sense. Humanity is hopelessly diverse and complex. You are going to have different perspective on what constitutes happiness or suffering or perfection. When you imagine utopia, those views are going to shape it. The concept of utopia is ultimately a very personalized thing. Despite their conflicting ideals, most of this anti-utopian literature seems to acknowledge that. They seem to say that totalizing ideologies aren't the foundation for a better future. They're an obstacle to it. I don't expect anyone to be quite like John in Brave New World. Nobody's really out there demanding the right to syphilis, at least I hope not. But I think he does have a point. I think the fulfillment of Mon's ideal does come at a cost to humanity. Is it worth the loss of empathy, of creativity, of self-expression? Autonomy? Would you really give up the right to have feelings and opinions and inspiration if it meant you never had to suffer? I think the question anti-utopian stories really ask is, when a perfect world comes at the cost of your humanity, can you really call it perfect? One thing I really admire about anti-utopian fiction is its incredibly tight thematic world building. Rapture, Oceania, the World State, they're all physical representations of their respective ideologies. They are worlds that really do look like their underpinning ethos. Frankly, I find it really inspiring. It makes me want to write. In-depth world building like that can be really hard, though. There's a lot to consider when you're making your own societies and political systems. It's a lot to untangle. I do know a pretty good roadmap for it, though. There's a series I really like called Creating Unique and Powerful Worlds, taught by many-time author and professor of fiction, Lincoln Michel. He does a great job explaining just how much world building can influence the rest of your writing, how it can shape your characters' personalities, the plot, even the themes of your story. It's surprising how much easier it gets once you establish that initial ripple effect, as he puts it. For Michel, world building isn't just set dressing. It's where a story begins. And if you want to learn to write like that too, then I have good news. You can go watch the course right now for free with our sponsor, Skillshare. Look, I know you've probably heard creators mention Skillshare a million times before. You've probably even heard me mention it. But I promise, it's not a conspiracy. For anyone who wants to learn a new skill, it really is just an exceptionally accessible way to do that. They have a good mission and they deliver on it well. We wouldn't accept them as a sponsor if they didn't. Skillshare puts the skills you've always wanted to learn within arm's reach by empowering other creatives to teach you what they know. It's less of an educational app and more of a community. And because there are so many creatives on Skillshare, it's got courses on pretty much everything. Coding, music, business, cooking, graphic design. Seriously, if there's a skill you want to learn, chances are someone's made a Skillshare course on it. The first 500 people who use our link will get Lincoln Michel's course and everything else Skillshare has to offer for free. 1 whole month of Skillshare without paying a dime. That's an awful lot of learning. And if it's not for you, cancel and never pay a dime. But at least give it a shot. I really think you'll love this course. Again, click the link in the description to get started for free. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!